The earth gave way beneath Rosa Garrett's feet with a sound like thunder splitting the sky. And in that moment, she understood what it meant to be swallowed whole by the wild landscape of northern Arizona territory. It had been raining for 3 days straight in Williams, a downpour the likes of which the mountain town had not seen in 15 years, according to the old-timers who gathered at the saloon. Rose had been foolish to venture out alone toward the canyon ridge, where her father's surveying equipment sat abandoned in a weathered wooden box. He had died 2 months prior, his heart simply giving out one morning over breakfast, and Rose had been slowly collecting his belongings from the various sites where he had worked mapping the railroad routes that would eventually connect Williams to the rest of the growing nation. It was 1887, and the Atlantic and Pacific Railroad had brought prosperity and chaos in equal measure to this pine-covered settlement perched at nearly 7,000 feet elevation. The rain had finally stopped that morning, and Rose thought she could make the journey safely. She was 22 years old, practical and strong from years of helping her father with his work, and she had grown up in this country. But the saturated earth had other plans. As she crossed the steep hillside, the ground simply liquefied beneath her, transforming from solid ground into a churning river of mud and rock that pulled her down with terrifying speed. Rose screamed as she tumbled, her body spinning in the thick brown current. Mud filled her mouth and nose. She clawed desperately at anything solid but found only more sliding earth. The world became a chaotic blur of motion and suffocation. She was being buried alive, dragged down the mountainside in tons of debris, and her lungs burned with the need for air she could not reach. This was how she would die, she realized with crystalline clarity, not in her bed as an old woman, but here on this anonymous hillside, becoming just another story the townspeople would tell about the dangers of the untamed land. Then something grabbed her arm. The grip was iron strong, wrenching her sideways with such force that her shoulders screamed in pain. But it was pulling her up, against the current of the mudslide, and Rose fought to help, kicking her legs even though they were trapped in the thick sludge. Her head broke the surface and she gasped, sucking in precious air mixed with spattering rain that had started falling again. Through the mud coating her eyes she saw a man, saw the intense concentration on his face as he hauled her bodily out of the flowing earth. "Hold on to me," he shouted over the roar of the continuing slide. His voice was rough, commanding, and Rose obeyed without thinking, wrapping her arms around his neck as he pulled them both toward a massive ponderosa pine that stood firm against the chaos. The mud was still moving, still trying to drag them down, but the stranger had one arm locked around the tree trunk and the other around Rose's waist, and he held them both there with shaking muscles until finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the worst of the slide passed. When the violent movement slowed to an oozing creep, the man carefully maneuvered them around the tree to more stable ground. Rose collapsed onto the wet earth, coughing and retching up mud. Her entire body shook with shock and exhaustion. She could hear the stranger breathing hard beside her, and when she finally managed to clear enough mud from her face to see properly, she found him staring at her with startling blue eyes set in a face weathered by sun and wind. "You all right?" he asked, his voice still rough but quieter now. Rose nodded, not trusting herself to speak yet. She took in her rescuer properly now. He was tall, lean in the way of men who spent their lives in the saddle, wearing typical cowboy attire that was now thoroughly caked with mud. A brown hat lay nearby where it had fallen during the rescue. His dark hair was plastered to his head, and his face, despite the mud, was handsome in a hard-edged way. He looked to be in his late 20s perhaps, with the kind of presence that suggested he was accustomed to dangerous situations. "What in God's name were you doing out here?" he asked, sitting back on his heels and wiping mud from his own face. "My father's equipment," Rose managed, her voice hoarse. "I was trying to collect it before the next storm." The stranger shook his head. "Nearly got yourself killed for some equipment. That was foolish, miss." Rose felt a flash of irritation cut through her shock. "I know these hills. I have been walking them my whole life." The rain had stopped. Ground was saturated. "Could have told you a slide was coming if you had asked." He stood and offered her his hand. "Kellan York. I have a ranch about 3 miles east of here. Was riding fence lines when I saw you heading up the ridge and thought you might run into trouble." Rose accepted his hand, noting the callous strength of it as he pulled her to her feet. "Rosa Garrett, and thank you. I would be dead if not for you." Something flickered in Kellan's eyes at her words, an emotion she could not quite identify. "Your father was Thomas Garrett, the surveyor. You knew him. Met him a few times when the railroad was scouting routes through my land. Good man. I am sorry for your loss." Kellan retrieved his hat and attempted to shake some of the mud off it with limited success. "We need to get you back to town. You are going to catch your death in those wet clothes, and we need to make sure you did not get injured in that slide." Rose looked down at herself. Her dress was completely ruined, torn and coated in mud. Her arms and legs were already beginning to show bruises, and her shoulders still ached from where Kellan had grabbed her. But she was alive. "I can walk," she said. "My horse is just over that rise. You will ride, I will walk beside." His tone suggested there would be no argument. They made their way carefully across the unstable ground to where a large bay gelding stood patiently waiting. The horse eyed them both with what Rose could have sworn was judgment about their muddy state, but stood steady as Kellan helped her into the saddle. The simple act of mounting made Rose aware of dozens of small pains she had not noticed in the immediate aftermath of the slide. The journey back to Williams took nearly 2 hours. Kellan kept the pace slow, his hand occasionally steadying the horse when they crossed areas where the ground was still soft. He did not speak much, but Rose found herself studying him as they traveled. There was something solid about him, something dependable. He moved through the landscape with the easy confidence of someone who belonged to it. "You said you have a ranch," Rose ventured after a long silence. Cattle and horses. Nothing too grand." "I have been building it up for about 8 years now." He glanced up at her. "You grew up in Williams, born here." "My mother died when I was young, so it was just my father and me. He taught me surveying, mathematics, how to read the land." Rose paused. "I have been trying to figure out what comes next now that he is gone. You have family elsewhere. An aunt in Kansas City. She has written asking me to come live with her." The prospect held no appeal. Rose had never been east of New Mexico territory, and the thought of city life felt suffocating. Kellan was quiet for a moment. "Seems like a person who knows surveying and mathematics might find work out here. Railroad is always expanding. They do not hire women for that kind of work." "No, I suppose they do not." He sounded genuinely regretful about that fact. By the time they reached the outskirts of Williams, the rain had picked up again, a steady drizzle that washed some of the mud from their clothes but left them both thoroughly chilled. Kellan walked Rose directly to Doc Peterson's house, insisting despite her protests that she needed to be examined. The elderly doctor took one look at the pair of them and ushered Rose inside while directing Kellan to the barn where he could tend to his horse. The examination revealed nothing more serious than bruises, scrapes, and one shoulder that would be sore for a few weeks, but was not seriously damaged. Doc Peterson's wife, Martha, helped Rose wash the remaining mud from her hair and skin, clucking with concern the entire time. They provided her with borrowed clothes since her own were beyond immediate salvation. When Rose emerged cleaned and dressed in a simple blue calico dress that Martha had insisted she keep, she found Kellan waiting on the front porch. He had also washed up, though his own clothes were still damp and muddy. He stood when he saw her, and Rose noticed for the first time without the coating of mud just how striking his features were. "Doc says you will be fine," he said, relief evident in his voice. "Thanks to you." Rose moved to stand beside him, looking out at the rain. "I owe you my life, Kellan York. I do not know how to repay such a debt." "No debt," Kellan said firmly. "Anyone would have done the same. But not anyone did. You did." Rose turned to face him fully. "At least let me cook you dinner once I get my own kitchen back in order. I am staying at the boarding house temporarily while I sort through my father's affairs." Kellan studied her face for a long moment, those blue eyes searching. "All right," he finally said. "I would like that." Over the next 2 weeks, Rose found herself thinking about the cowboy rancher more than she cared to admit. She had always been practical, focused on work and helping her father, with little time for the kinds of romantic entanglements that other young women her age seemed to pursue. But there was something about Kellan York that had lodged itself in her mind. The memory of his strength, yes, but more than that. The quiet competence. The way he had treated her as a person rather than a fragile thing to be coddled. She finally sent word through the general store that she would be pleased if he would join her for dinner at the boarding house on Saturday evening. The response came back the next day, a simple note in angular handwriting that said he would be there at 6. Rose spent an embarrassing amount of time preparing for that dinner. She borrowed the boarding house kitchen with the owner's permission and made roasted chicken with vegetables, biscuits, and an apple pie using the last of the preserved apples from her father's small root cellar. She wore her best dress, a deep green that brought out the auburn highlights in her brown hair, and she spent extra time pinning her hair up in a style more elaborate than her usual practical braid. When Kellan arrived precisely at 6, freshly shaved and wearing clothes that were clearly his best, Rose felt her heart do an unexpected flutter. He held his hat in his hands and seemed almost nervous, which Rose found endearing from a man who had faced down a mudslide without hesitation. "You look lovely," he said, and the sincerity in his voice made Rose blush. "Come in. Everything is ready." The dinner was a success by any measure. They talked easily, the conversation flowing from topic to topic. Kellan told her about his ranch, about the challenges of building something from almost nothing. He had come to Arizona Territory from Texas, he explained, after his parents died and he wanted a fresh start. He had worked as a cowboy on other people's ranches, until he had saved enough to buy his own land. Rose told him about her childhood following her father around with his surveying equipment, learning to calculate grades and distances before she learned to read. She talked about her love of the landscape around Williams, the way the ponderosa forest smelled like vanilla in the summer heat, the clarity of the night sky at this elevation. "I could not imagine leaving this place," she admitted, "even if staying means I have limited prospects." "What would you do if you could do anything?" Kellan asked, leaning forward with genuine interest. "Keep surveying. Map this entire territory. There is so much that has not been properly documented." Rose paused, then laughed self-consciously. "That sounds foolish, I know. A woman surveyor." "Sounds ambitious. Sounds right for someone like you." Kellan's expression was serious. "World is changing, Rose. Maybe slower than it should, but it is changing." As the evening wore on, Rose became increasingly aware of the attraction building between them. The way Kellan looked at her when he thought she was not watching. The way her skin tingled when their hands accidentally brushed reaching for the same serving dish. the warmth that spread through her chest when he laughed at something she said. When it was time for him to leave, they stood together at the door of the boarding house, neither quite ready to say goodbye. "I would like to see you again," Kellan said, his voice low. "If that would be all right with you." "I would like that very much," Rose replied, her heart racing. "There is a dance next Saturday at the town hall. Would you accompany me?" Rose had not been to a dance in over a year, not since her father's health had started declining. But the thought of going with Kellan, of having his hand at her waist as they moved across the floor, made her smile. "Yes." Kellan smiled back, a genuine expression that transformed his usually serious face. "Good night, Rosa Garrett." "Good night, Kellan York." The week until the dance seemed to crawl by. Rose finished sorting through her father's papers, a bittersweet task that left her both sad and grateful for the memories. She found detailed notes about all his survey work, carefully recorded observations that represented a lifetime of study. Among the papers was a letter addressed to her, written in her father's shaking hand. "My dearest Rose," it read. "If you are reading this, I have gone to join your mother, and I hope you can forgive me for leaving you alone in this world. You have been my greatest joy and my finest work. I know you have the mind and the spirit to do great things, but I fear the world will not make it easy for you. Do not let that stop you. Be bold. Be brave. Find happiness wherever you can. You deserve all the good things life has to offer. Your loving father." Rose wept over that letter, clutching it to her chest. Then she carefully folded it and placed it in the small wooden box where she kept her most precious belongings. Be bold, her father had written. Be brave. When Saturday arrived, Rose wore her mother's necklace, a simple silver chain with a small turquoise pendant that her father had always said matched her eyes. The same green dress from the dinner, freshly pressed. Her hair pinned up with small wildflowers that Martha Peterson had brought by that afternoon with a knowing smile. Kellan arrived in a wagon rather than on horseback, clearly planning ahead for the ride home. He looked handsome in a black vest over a white shirt, his dark hair neatly combed. When he saw Rose, his eyes widened slightly. "You are beautiful," he said simply. The dance was already well underway when they arrived. The town hall was crowded with people, the air warm despite the open windows. A small group of musicians played fiddle, guitar, and harmonica in one corner, the lively music filling the space. Rose recognized most of the faces, people she had known her whole life, and she saw more than a few curious and approving glances directed at her and Kellan. "Shall we?" Kellan offered his hand. Rose took it and let him lead her onto the floor. He was a good dancer, confident and sure in his movements, and Rose found it easy to follow his lead. They spun through reels and waltzes, taking breaks only when they needed to catch their breath. During one such break, sharing a ladle of punch, Sarah Winters approached. Sarah had been Rose's closest friend growing up, though they had seen less of each other in recent years. "Rosa Garrett, you have been holding out on me," Sarah said with a teasing smile. "When did this happen?" She gestured between Rose and Kellan. "Sarah, this is Kellan York, Kellan Sarah Winters. She runs the school here in town." Kellan tipped his hat politely. "Pleased to meet you, madam." "Oh, I like this one," Sarah said to Rose. "Polite and handsome, you had better keep him." Rose felt her face heat, but she was saved from having to respond when the music started up again, and Kellan pulled her back onto the floor. As they danced, Rose felt something shifting inside her, some long, dormant part of herself waking up. She had been so focused on survival, on taking care of her father, and then dealing with his death, that she had forgotten what it felt like to simply be young and alive and full of possibility. "What are you thinking?" Kellan asked, his voice close to her ear as they moved through a slower waltz. "That I am happy," Rose said honestly. I have not felt this way in a long time. Kellan's arm tightened slightly at her waist. Good. You should be happy, Rose. As the evening wore on, they found themselves drifting outside to escape the heat and noise. The night air was cool and clear, the stars brilliant overhead. They walked a short distance from the hall, their footsteps crunching on the dirt road. I have been thinking, Kellan said, breaking the comfortable silence. About what you said at dinner, about wanting to keep surveying. It was just a dream, Rose said, though her heart sank a little at dismissing it. What if it did not have to be? I have been wanting to properly map my ranch land. All I have is the basic property description from when I bought it, but I want to know exact elevations, water sources, best routes for moving cattle. I could hire you to do the work. Rose stopped walking and turned to face him. Kellan, you do not have to create work for me out of pity. It is not pity. His expression was earnest in the starlight. I genuinely need the work done, and you are qualified to do it. More qualified than most of the men I could hire if I am being honest. Plus, you would be doing me a favor. I trust you. I do not know what to say. Say yes. Say you will at least think about it. Rose looked up at this man who had saved her life, who was now offering her a way to keep doing the work she loved. Yes, she said. I will do it. Kellan's smile was bright even in the darkness. Then his expression grew more serious, more intent. Rose, I need to tell you something. I have not been able to stop thinking about you since the day of the mudslide. I know we have not known each other long, but I feel something here. Something real. Rose's breath caught. I feel it too. Can I kiss you? Instead of answering, Rose stepped closer and lifted her face to his. Kellan cupped her cheek gently with one hand, then lowered his lips to hers. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, then grew deeper as Rose pressed closer. She felt it all the way to her toes, a warmth that spread through her entire body. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Kellan rested his forehead against hers. I am falling in love with you, Rosa Garrett. I am falling in love with you too, Rose whispered back. They stood there in the starlight, holding each other, and Rose thought about how strange life was. A few weeks ago she had been alone and directionless, nearly killed by the unforgiving land. Now she stood in the arms of a good man, with work she loved ahead of her and a future that suddenly seemed full of promise. The surveying work began the following week. Kellan rode out to the boarding house early Monday morning with a pack horse loaded with equipment. He had purchased proper surveying tools. Rose realized quality instruments that must have cost a significant sum. You did not have to do this, she said, running her hand over a beautiful brass transit. Good tools for good work, Kellan replied. Besides, you will need proper equipment if you are going to make a business of this. Over the next several weeks, Rose and Kellan spent nearly every day together on his ranch land. Rose took careful measurements, created detailed maps, identified optimal locations for wells and fences. Kellan helped her carry equipment, hold measuring rods, and mark boundaries. They worked well together, Rose realized. They had an easy rhythm and instinct for what the other needed. But it was not all work. They took breaks for lunch under the pines, talking about everything and nothing. Kellan told her stories about his childhood in Texas, about learning to ride before he could properly walk. Rose shared memories of her parents, keeping them alive through the telling. They kissed often, stolen moments of sweetness that left Rose dizzy. One afternoon, nearly 2 months after the mudslide, they were working near the northern boundary of Kellan's property when storm clouds began gathering. Rose looked up at the darkening sky with a slight shiver, memories of that terrifying day still fresh. Kellan noticed immediately. We can head back. No, I am fine, just being silly. But as the first drops of rain began to fall, Rose felt her breathing quicken, an edge of panic creeping in. Kellan was beside her in an instant, taking her face in his hands. "Look at me, Rose, you are safe. I am right here and I will always keep you safe. You understand?" Rose nodded, focusing on his steady blue eyes, his calm presence. The panic slowly receded. "I am sorry. You have nothing to be sorry for. What you went through would shake anyone." He kissed her forehead gently. "But we should get to shelter anyway. There is an old line shack about a quarter-mile west. Come on." They made it to the small cabin just as the rain began in earnest. It was a simple structure, just one room with a stove, a bunk, and some basic supplies that Kellan kept stocked for times when he needed to stay out on the range. Kellan quickly got a fire going while Rose looked around the tidy space. "You stay here often?" she asked. "During calving season sometimes, or when I am working on the far sections of the ranch. It is not much, but it serves its purpose." The rain drummed on the roof, heavy and relentless. Rose moved to the small window and watched it fall, but this time without fear. She was warm and dry and safe with Kellan. "Rose," Kellan said from behind her. She turned to find him standing near the fire, his expression vulnerable in a way she had not seen before. "I need to ask you something." "What is it?" "These past 2 months with you have been the happiest of my life. When I wake up in the morning, I think about seeing you. When I go to sleep at night, I think about what we did that day. You have become essential to me, Rose, essential as breathing." Rose's heart was pounding. She knew what was coming, could feel it in the charged air between them. Kellan crossed the small space to stand before her. "I love you. I want to spend my life with you. I want to wake up beside you every morning and fall asleep holding you every night. I want to build a future together, whatever that looks like." He took both her hands in his. "Rose Garrett, will you marry me?" Tears sprang to Rose's eyes, but they were happy tears. "Yes. Yes, Kellan, I will marry you." Kellan let out a breath she did not think he knew he was holding, then pulled her into his arms and kissed her deeply. Rose melted into him, into the rightness of this moment. When they finally broke apart, both laughing with joy, Kellan pulled a small box from his vest pocket. "I have been carrying this around for a week, waiting for the right moment," he admitted, opening it to reveal a simple gold band with a small diamond. "It was my grandmother's ring. My mother gave it to me before she died, told me to give it to someone worthy when I found her." Rose let him slip the ring onto her finger, marveling at how perfectly it fit. "I love you, Kellan York. I love you so much." They married a month later in a simple ceremony at the small church in Williams. Sarah stood up for Rose, and Kellan's ranch foreman, an older cowboy named Pete who had worked with him for 6 years, stood up for him. Half the town attended, crammed into the little church to witness Rosa Garrett and Kellan York pledge their lives to each other. Rose wore a dress of cream-colored linen that Martha Peterson had helped her sew, with her mother's necklace at her throat. Kellan wore his best suit, and the look in his eyes when Rose walked down the aisle made her feel like the most beautiful woman in the world. The words of the ceremony seemed to echo with extra meaning, for better or worse, in sickness and in health. Rose meant every word of her vows, looking into Kellan's eyes and promising to love him, honor him, stand beside him through whatever life brought their way. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Kellan kissed her with such tenderness that Rose heard several women in the congregation sigh. The celebration afterward at the town hall was lively and joyous. There was music and dancing, food and drink, and more well wishes than Rose could count. As the evening wore on and they prepared to leave for the ranch that was now her home, Sarah pulled Rose aside. "You look so happy," Sarah said, squeezing Rose's hands. "I am so glad you found him." "Or he found you, I suppose. I nearly died, Sarah, if he had not been there that day. But he was there, And now you get to build a life together. That is what matters." Rose hugged her friend tightly. "Thank you for being here today. Always. You are my dearest friend, Rose York." Sarah smiled at using Rose's new name. "Now go. Your husband is waiting to take you home." The ride to the ranch in the wagon, just the two of them finally alone, felt dreamlike. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Kellan held her hand, occasionally bringing it to his lips to kiss her knuckles. Neither spoke much, content in the comfortable silence of two people who knew they had a lifetime for talking ahead of them. The ranch house was simple but well built, a two-room cabin that Kellan had constructed himself. He had clearly made an effort to ready it for a bride. The windows had new curtains, the floor had been freshly scrubbed, and there were wildflowers in a jar on the table. At the threshold, Kellan surprised Rose by sweeping her up into his arms. "What are you doing?" she laughed. "Carrying my bride over the threshold. It is tradition." He kissed her nose. "Welcome home, Mrs. York." Their wedding night was tender and passionate, a discovery of each other that felt both exciting and natural. Kellan was patient and gentle, and Rose felt cherished in a way she never had before. Afterward, lying in his arms in the darkness, listening to his steady heartbeat, Rose felt a peace settle over her that went bone deep. "Are you happy?" Kellan murmured against her hair. "More than I ever thought possible," Rose answered truthfully. The next months were an adjustment as they learned to live together, learned each other's rhythms and habits. Rose continued her surveying work, and word began to spread about her skills. Other ranchers started seeking her out for mapping work, though always with Kellan's presence required to make it proper. Rose chafed a bit at the restriction, but recognized the reality of the times. She and Kellan worked together to improve the ranch, using her survey maps to identify the best locations for a new barn, additional corrals, and a larger house they hoped to build eventually. In the evenings, they would sit together on the porch, watching the sunset paint the ponderosa pines gold, and talk about their plans and dreams. "I was thinking," Kellan said one such evening, "that if your surveying work continues to grow, we might need to build you a proper office. Maybe in town, so clients can come to you." Rose turned to look at him in surprise. "That would be expensive. You are bringing in good money with your work. It would be an investment in the business, your business." He smiled at her. "Rosa Garrett York, surveyor, has a nice ring to it." "You really believe in me, do not you?" Rose said softly. "With my whole heart. You are brilliant and capable, and you deserve the chance to do what you love." Kellan took her hand. "Besides, I am proud of you. I want the whole world to know how remarkable my wife is." Rose kissed him, pouring all her love and gratitude into it. She had been so afraid after her father died that her life was over, that all her dreams would have to be buried with him. Instead, she had found a partner who not only supported her ambitions but actively worked to help her achieve them. The following spring brought changes. Rose discovered she was pregnant, a revelation that filled them both with joy and no small amount of terror. Kellan became even more protective, worrying about her working in the field, but Rose insisted she was fine and continued her surveying projects well into her 6th month. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time," she reminded Kellan when he fretted. "I am not fragile." "I know you are not fragile," he replied, "but you are precious to me, and so is our child. Let me worry. It is a husband's prerogative." Their son was born in October of 1888, a healthy baby boy with Kellan's blue eyes and a surprisingly loud cry. They named him Thomas after Rose's father, and Kellan wept when Rose told him the name she had chosen. He would have loved to meet him, Kellan said, holding his tiny son with the careful reverence of a new father. "I think he knows," Rose replied. "Somehow I think he knows." Being a mother was harder than Rose had anticipated, but also more rewarding. Thomas was a demanding infant who did not sleep well, but when he looked up at her with those bright blue eyes, Rose felt her heart might burst with love. Kellan was a devoted father, walking the floor at night with a crying baby, changing diapers without complaint, singing silly songs that made Thomas gurgle with laughter. Rose had to curtail her surveying work for several months after Thomas was born, but she found she did not mind as much as she thought she would. There would be time for work later. For now, she was content to focus on her family. Though she did spend Thomas's nap times working on a comprehensive map of the Williams area, compiling years of her father's notes with her own observations into what she hoped would be a useful resource for future development. By the time Thomas was 2, Rose was back to taking surveying jobs, often bringing her son along in a pack on her back. The local ranchers grew accustomed to seeing Rosa York striding across the landscape with a toddler riding contentedly behind her, playing with her braided hair. Kellan's ranch continued to prosper. They were able to expand their herd, build the new barn they had planned, and start construction on a larger house. The new house would have 3 bedrooms, a separate dining room, and a proper office for Rose's surveying business. It was more than either of them had dared dream of in those early days. One evening, as they sat on the porch of what would soon be their old house watching Thomas chase fireflies in the gathering dusk, Kellan pulled Rose close. "You ever think about that day?" he asked. "The mudslide." Rose was quiet for a moment, considering. "Sometimes, less often now than I used to. Why? I think about it all the time. I think about what would have happened if I had not ridden out that day, if I had not seen you heading up that ridge. I think about a world where I never met you, and it terrifies me." Rose turned in his arms to face him. "But you did ride out. You did see me. And you saved my life, Kellan, not just that day on the mountain, but every day since. You gave me a reason to keep going when I did not know if I could." "You saved me too," Kellan said. "I was just existing before you, just going through the motions. You made me realize what it meant to truly live." They kissed as the stars began to appear overhead, their son's laughter ringing out across the ranch land. It was a perfect moment, Rose thought. A moment of pure happiness. 2 years later, they welcomed a daughter. She had Rose's auburn hair and a temperament that suggested she would be every bit as stubborn as her mother. They named her Grace, and Thomas adored his little sister with a devotion that made both parents smile. Rose's surveying business continued to grow. She eventually did open an office in Williams, a small building near the center of town where she met with clients and drafted her maps. She hired a young assistant, a woman from Flagstaff who had studied mathematics and was thrilled to find work that used her education. Together, they mapped much of Coconino County, building a reputation for accuracy and professionalism that reached far beyond Williams. Kellan expanded into horse breeding, developing a line of sturdy ranch horses that were well suited to the high country terrain. His herd grew to be some of the finest in northern Arizona territory, and buyers came from as far as California to purchase York horses. As the years passed and Arizona moved toward statehood, Rose and Kellan built a life that neither could have imagined in those early uncertain days. They had struggles, of course. There were droughts that threatened the ranch, illnesses that frightened them, and the normal conflicts that come with any marriage. But they faced everything together, partners in the truest sense. Thomas grew into a serious young man who loved the ranch and planned to take it over someday. Grace proved to have her mother's head for figures and her father's way with horses, a combination that suggested she would make her own mark on the world. In 1895, they had one more child, another boy they named James, who arrived as a surprise just when Rose thought their family was complete. By the time Arizona achieved statehood in 1912, Rose and Kellan had been married for nearly 25 years. They stood together in Williams watching the celebrations, surrounded by their children and now several grandchildren, marveling at how much the world had changed. "We have been part of history," Rose said to Kellan as fireworks lit up the sky. "We helped build this state." "You helped map it," Kellan corrected with a smile. "Your work will be used for generations." Rose leaned against her husband, feeling the solid strength of him that had never wavered in all their years together. She thought about that terrified young woman who had been swept away by a mudslide, who thought she was dying on a mountainside. That woman could never have imagined standing here now, successful and loved, part of a family and a community she had helped shape. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what? For saving me, for seeing me, for loving me exactly as I am." Kellan pressed a kiss to her temple. "Loving you has been the easiest thing I have ever done, Rose, the honor of my life." They stayed for the rest of the celebration, but eventually made their way home to the ranch. The house they had built together stood solid and welcoming, lights glowing in the windows. As they walked up the porch steps, Kellan caught Rose's hand and spun her around in an impromptu dance, humming the same waltz they had danced to at that first town hall gathering all those years ago. Rose laughed and followed his lead, and they danced there on the porch under the stars, two people who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful together. Inside, they could hear their family, the sounds of conversation and laughter. But for just this moment, it was only the two of them, still as in love as they had been in the beginning. Maybe more so, Rose thought, because this love had been tested and proven. It had weathered storms both literal and metaphorical. It had grown and deepened with every passing year. "I love you, Kellan York," Rose said as their impromptu dance came to an end. "I love you, Rose York," he replied. "Always have, always will." They went inside together, hand in hand, ready for whatever the future held. Because they had learned the most important lesson life could teach. That with the right person beside you, you could survive anything. Even a mudslide that should have been a grave but instead became the beginning of something extraordinary. The years continued to roll by with the steady inevitability of the seasons. Thomas married a rancher's daughter from Flagstaff and took over the day-to-day operations of the ranch, though Kellan still worked alongside him most days. He claimed retirement did not suit him, and Rose suspected he simply could not imagine not being out on the land he loved. Grace, true to form, defied expectations by attending the newly established university in Tucson, one of the first women to study engineering there. She returned to Williams with her degree and shocked everyone by announcing she was going to work with the railroad, using her mother's maps to plan new routes. Rose could not have been prouder. James, their youngest, became a veterinarian, studying in California before returning home to establish a practice that served all the ranchers in the region. He had inherited his father's gentle way with animals and his mother's steady hands, a combination that served him well in his chosen profession. Rose continued her surveying work well into her 50s, only gradually reducing her workload as her joints began to protest the long days in the field. Her maps had become the standard reference for the region, used by ranchers, railroad companies, and the territorial government. She had achieved something rare: professional respect in a field dominated by men, earned through undeniable skill and unwavering persistence. On their 30th wedding anniversary, Kellan surprised Rose with a trip. They left the ranch in Thomas's capable hands and traveled by train to California, something neither of them had done before. They spent 2 weeks exploring San Francisco, marveling at the city that had risen from the ashes of the great earthquake, walking along the waterfront, eating at restaurants where they were anonymous strangers rather than pillars of their small community. One evening, standing on a bluff watching the sun set over the Pacific Ocean, Kellan pulled Rose close. 30 years, he said, wonder in his voice. Sometimes it feels like yesterday. Sometimes it feels like we have always been together. Both, Rose replied. It feels like both. Do you have any regrets? Rose considered the question seriously. She thought about the life she might have had if she had gone to Kansas City, or if she had never ventured out that rainy day to collect her father's equipment. She thought about the doors that had been closed to her because she was a woman in a man's world, the opportunities she had been denied. But then she thought about everything she had gained, a partner who believed in her, children and grandchildren who filled her life with joy, work that mattered, a home in a place she loved, respect hard-earned and freely given. No, she said finally, I have no regrets. This life, our life, it is everything I never knew I wanted. Kellan smiled, that same smile that had captivated her 30 years ago. Good, because I would not change a single thing. Except maybe I would have kissed you sooner that first night at the dance. Rose laughed. We kissed that same night, you romantic fool. Yes, but I waited until we were outside. I should have kissed you right there on the dance floor in front of everyone. You would have scandalized the whole town. Would have been worth it. They stood there watching the waves crash against the rocks below, two people who had built a life together from the rubble of near tragedy. The ocean was nothing like the high desert country they called home, but its vastness, its power, reminded Rose of that mudslide all those years ago. How close she had come to losing everything before she even knew what she had to lose. Thank you for pulling me out of that mud, she said suddenly. Kellan looked at her in surprise. Rose, you have thanked me for that 100 times. I know, but I will thank you 100 more. You gave me this life, Kellan. Every good thing I have comes from that moment when you refused to let me die. No, Kellan said firmly. I may have pulled you out of the mud, but you built this life. You built your business, raised our children, made a name for yourself. That was all you, Rose. I was just lucky enough to be along for the ride. We built it together, Rose insisted. Everything we have, we built together. They returned to Williams refreshed and ready to embrace the next chapter of their lives. Rose officially retired from surveying at 58, though she continued to consult on special projects and mentored several young people interested in the field. She spent her newfound free time writing, documenting the history of Williams and the surrounding area, combining her technical knowledge with stories from the old-timers who had been there when the town was founded. Kellan, now in his 60s, finally agreed to let Thomas handle more of the ranch work, though he still rode out most mornings to check on the horses. Rose often rode with him, the two of them moving across the familiar landscape with the ease of long practice. They would stop at their favorite spots, places that held memories from over the years, and sit together in comfortable silence. Their family grew. Thomas and his wife had 4 children who ran wild across the ranch, learning to ride and rope and work the land. Grace married late, a fellow engineer she met while working on a railroad project, and they settled in Phoenix with their 2 children. James married young to a teacher from Winslow, and they had 3 children who visited the ranch often. Rose and Kellan's home became the gathering place for the whole sprawling family, especially during holidays. Those celebrations were loud and chaotic, filled with laughter and storytelling, children running everywhere and adults trying to keep track of them all. Rose loved every minute of it. In 1920, when Rose was 60, she received a letter from the Arizona Historical Society. They were creating an exhibition about the women who had helped build the state, and they wanted to feature her surveying work. Rose was simultaneously honored and embarrassed, but Kellan insisted she accept. "Your work matters," he told her. "It deserves to be recognized. You deserve to be recognized." The exhibition opening was one of the proudest days of Rose's life. To see her maps displayed in a museum, to read the placard describing her contributions to Arizona's development, to have her work validated in such a public way, it meant more than she could express. Her whole family attended, 3 generations of Yorks standing together looking at Rose's legacy. As they left the exhibition, one of Rose's granddaughters, Thomas's eldest who was 14 and full of questions, asked, "Grandma, how did you do it? How did you become a surveyor when women were not supposed to do that?" Rose thought about how to answer. "I had a father who taught me. I had skills that were needed, and most importantly, I had a husband who believed I could do anything I set my mind to and helped make it possible." She looked at Kellan, who smiled back at her. "Also," Rose continued, "I was stubborn. Never underestimate the power of being too stubborn to give up." The years moved faster as they aged, each season seeming to rush past quicker than the last. They celebrated their 40th anniversary surrounded by family, and then their 45th. Kellan's hair went fully gray, and Rose's auburn turned to silver. They moved slower, their bodies showing the wear of lives fully lived, but they were still together, still partners in every sense. On their 50th wedding anniversary in 1937, the whole town of Williams threw them a party. It seemed like everyone they had ever known came to celebrate, along with many people who knew them only by reputation. There were speeches and toasts, stories and laughter. Someone had even tracked down the same musicians who had played at their wedding, though they were all old men now, and they played the waltz Rose and Kellan had danced to that first night. "May I have this dance, Mrs. York?" Kellan asked, standing before her with his hand extended just as he had 50 years before. "Always, Mr. York," Rose replied, taking his hand. They moved slowly across the floor, not with the speed and energy of youth but with something better, something deeper. A connection forged over 5 decades of shared life. Every person in that room watched them dance, and more than a few had tears in their eyes at the sight of such enduring love. When the song ended, Kellan did not let go. He held Rose close and whispered in her ear, "Best decision I ever made, riding out to check on a stubborn woman heading into danger on a rainy day. Best decision I ever made letting you rescue me," Rose whispered back. "I love you, Rose. Today, tomorrow, and forever." "I love you too, Kellan." Always. They lived 11 more years together, years marked by the quiet contentment of 2 people who had found everything they needed in each other. They watched their grandchildren grow and begin their own families. They saw Arizona continue to change and grow. They sat on their porch every evening, holding hands and watching the sunset, never taking for granted the gift of another day together. Kellan passed peacefully in his sleep in the winter of 1948, at the age of 87. He simply did not wake up one morning, his heart finally giving out after nearly 9 decades of steady beating. Rose was devastated, the loss of her partner leaving a hole in her life that nothing could fill. But she took comfort in knowing they had been given 50 wonderful years together, more than many people ever got. Rose lived 3 more years, surrounded by her loving family. She spent that time finishing her historical writings, ensuring that the stories of early Williams and the people who built it would not be forgotten. She told her grandchildren and great-grandchildren stories about their grandfather, keeping his memory alive through her words. On a spring morning in 1951, Rose York passed away quietly in the house she and Kellan had built together. She was 84 years old. They buried her beside Kellan in the Williams Cemetery, under the ponderosa pines they had both loved. The headstone was simple: Rosa Garrett York, 1865–1951, beloved wife, mother, grandmother. She mapped the land and found her way home. Kellan York, 1861–1948, beloved husband, father, grandfather. He saved her life and she saved his heart, together forever. Their story became part of Williams' history, passed down through generations. The tale of how Kellan York pulled Rosa Garrett from a deadly mudslide and found his future wife. How they built a successful ranch and surveying business. How they raised a family and helped build Arizona. How they loved each other deeply and truly for 50 years, proving that sometimes the worst moments of our lives lead us directly to the best. The ranch stayed in the York family, passed down through Thomas's line. Rosa's maps remained in use for decades, treasured not just for their accuracy, but for what they represented. Grace's children followed her into engineering, carrying on the family tradition of shaping the landscape. James's children became doctors and teachers and ranchers, spreading across Arizona, but always remembering their roots in Williams. And every generation told the story to their children. The story of how it all began with a mudslide, a cowboy, and a woman too stubborn to give up on her dreams. A love story that proved the power of two people who chose each other every single day, building something that lasted long after they were gone. A reminder that sometimes being saved is just the beginning, and the real miracle is everything that comes after.